It begins with a whisper of history, a tension lingering in the humid air of Southeast Asia, where the verdant jungles of Vietnam conceal stories of courage, sacrifice, and conflict that would reverberate across the globe. Before we delve into the conflict that would come to define a generation, it's vital to understand the land itself. Vietnam, a narrow, elongated country stretching along the South China Sea, has been a crossroads of civilizations for centuries. From its early days under the influence of Chinese dynasties to its colonial struggles with the French, Vietnam's history is layered with external pressures and internal resilience. The seeds of the Vietnam War were sown long before the first American troops set foot on its soil. After centuries under Chinese control, Vietnam had fought tirelessly for autonomy. The Nguyen dynasty, which ruled in the 19th century, attempted to consolidate power and resist European imperialism. But the French eventually established colonial dominance by the mid-1800s. This period of colonial rule reshaped Vietnam's political, social, and economic structures. The French introduced modern infrastructure, education systems, and economic reforms, but at a steep human cost. Land was appropriated, peasants were exploited, and nationalist sentiments began simmering beneath the surface. By the early 20th century, these nationalist movements had gained momentum. Revolutionary leaders emerged, inspired both by local traditions and global ideologies. Among them was Ho Chi Minh, a young man whose vision of Vietnamese independence would define the mid-century struggle. Ho traveled extensively, absorbing ideas from the wider world, Marxism, anti-colonial movements, and revolutionary strategies from other nations. His charisma and ideological clarity helped him galvanize the fragmented nationalist movements into a cohesive force, eventually leading to the foundation of the Viet Minh, a coalition committed to the liberation of Vietnam from foreign domination. World War II acted as a catalyst for change. When the Japanese occupied Vietnam, the French colonial administration was weakened, creating a power vacuum that the Viet Minh skillfully exploited. Guerrilla tactics, clandestine operations, and the ability to mobilize the local population made the Viet Minh an effective force against occupying powers. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, asserting the nation's independence. Yet the world's geopolitical realities would not allow such a declaration to go uncontested. The French, unwilling to relinquish their colonial holdings, returned with renewed vigor, sparking the First Indochina War. This conflict, which lasted from 1946 to 1954, pitted the Viet Minh's guerrilla forces against French conventional troops. The war was brutal and complex, involving conventional battles, guerrilla skirmishes, and the struggle for legitimacy in the eyes of the Vietnamese people. The French sought to re-establish their colonial administration, while the Viet Minh fought for national self-determination, often relying on local support and their knowledge of the terrain to offset the technological superiority of their opponents. The decisive moment of this early conflict came at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Nestled in a remote valley, this French garrison became the focal point of a dramatic siege. Ho Chi Minh forces surrounded and systematically dismantled the French defenses, employing both strategic planning and the relentless endurance of their fighters. When the French finally surrendered, it marked not only the end of their colonial ambitions in Vietnam, but also a significant moment in the global decolonization movement. The Geneva Accords, which followed, temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, establishing a communist North under Ho Chi Minh and a non-communist South under a separate administration, with promises of eventual nationwide elections that were never realized. This division created the fertile ground for the Vietnam War as the world would come to know it. The Cold War context transformed Vietnam from a national struggle into a global confrontation. The United States, perceiving the spread of communism as a threat to global stability and its own strategic interests, began supporting the South Vietnamese government. What started as advisory support escalated over the years into a full-scale military engagement that would draw in hundreds of thousands of American troops, as well as forces from other allied nations. The early years of the American involvement were characterized by a belief in the domino theory, the idea that the fall of one nation to communism would precipitate the fall of its neighbors. This strategic rationale guided policy decisions and military strategies. The U.S. government provided financial aid, military equipment, and advisory personnel to the South Vietnamese army, attempting to stabilize the region and prevent a communist takeover. Yet, the complexity of Vietnam's internal politics, regional loyalties, and cultural factors presented challenges that conventional military approaches struggled to address. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the conflict escalated as the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, gained strength in the South. These insurgents, supported and supplied by the North, conducted guerrilla operations, ambushes, and acts of sabotage against the South Vietnamese government and its allies. Their ability to blend into the civilian population and operate within the dense jungles made them a formidable adversary. American forces, initially tasked with advisory roles, found themselves drawn deeper into a conflict that was as political and psychological as it was military. The assassination of President Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963 marked a turning point in South Vietnamese politics. Diem's regime, though aligned with the United States, was increasingly viewed as corrupt and authoritarian. His removal led to political instability, providing the North and the Viet Cong with opportunities to expand their influence. For the United States, this period underscored the difficulties of intervening in a foreign nation with complex internal dynamics. Military advisors now faced the daunting task of supporting an unstable government while combating an increasingly sophisticated insurgency. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 became the catalyst for direct U.S. military engagement. Alleged attacks on American naval vessels prompted the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to escalate military action without a formal declaration of war. This marked the beginning of sustained combat operations involving large numbers of American troops, conducting extensive bombing campaigns and attempting to win hearts and minds through pacification programs and civic action initiatives. Yet, the realities of Vietnam's geography, climate, and social structure posed enormous challenges. Dense jungles, swamps, and mountainous terrain hindered conventional military maneuvers. The monsoon season brought torrential rains that could stall operations and create logistical nightmares. Roads and supply lines were vulnerable to ambushes, and the Viet Cong's extensive network of tunnels provided both concealment and strategic advantage. Moreover, the local population often found itself caught between opposing forces, creating a humanitarian crisis that complicated military objectives. American tactics evolved to meet these challenges, including search and destroy missions, aerial bombardments, and chemical defoliants such as Agent Orange, intended to deprive the enemy of cover. These strategies, however, had devastating consequences for the environment and the civilian population. Villages were destroyed, crops ruined, and countless innocent lives lost. As the war dragged on, public opinion in the United States began to shift. Images of the conflict, broadcast into living rooms across America, fueled protests, social upheaval, and a growing anti-war movement. Media coverage played a pivotal role in shaping perceptions of the war. Television broadcasts, photographs, and journalistic accounts brought the harsh realities of combat into stark relief. The Tet Offensive of 1968, a coordinated series of attacks by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on cities and military installations throughout South Vietnam, shattered the illusion of progress and exposed the vulnerability of U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Although militarily the offensive was repelled, psychologically it had a profound impact, eroding public confidence and demands for withdrawal. Amidst this backdrop, Vietnamese civilians endured tremendous suffering. The war displaced millions, disrupted traditional communities, and led to widespread famine and disease. Both North and South faced challenges in maintaining governance, delivering aid, and protecting citizens from violence. The resilience and suffering of the Vietnamese people became an enduring testament to their strength and the human cost of prolonged conflict. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the war were complex and often fraught with setbacks. Peace talks in Paris, intermittent ceasefires, and back-channel negotiations sought to find a path to reconciliation. But ideological divides and mutual distrust hindered progress. The United States faced the challenge of balancing domestic political pressures with strategic objectives, while North Vietnam remained committed to reunification under communist governance. This protracted stalemate underscored the difficulty of achieving a negotiated settlement. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had reached a stage of profound complexity and exhaustion. The strategy of Vietnamization, introduced by President Richard Nixon, sought to transfer the responsibility of combat to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. This approach aimed to maintain U.S. credibility and reduce domestic opposition to the war, but it faced significant challenges. The South Vietnamese Army, despite receiving extensive training and equipment, often struggled to match the operational effectiveness and determination of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Morale, leadership, and logistical constraints limited their capacity to operate independently in a highly hostile environment. American troops, on the other hand, were caught in a paradoxical struggle. After years of combat, the psychological and physical toll of the war weighed heavily on soldiers. Jungle warfare, ambushes, booby traps, and constant threats of sudden attack created an atmosphere of relentless tension. The landscape of Vietnam, its dense forests, hidden tunnels, and expansive river networks, presented an adversary in the terrain itself. Soldiers often faced the dual challenge of combating an enemy while navigating unfamiliar and hazardous conditions, which magnified stress and fatigue. Alongside these hardships, political directives sometimes conflicted with tactical realities on the ground, creating confusion and frustration among troops. Meanwhile, anti-war sentiment in the United States intensified. College campuses, city streets, and public forums became arenas for protest and debate. The imagery of the war, broadcast nightly on television, brought the violence and human suffering of Vietnam directly into American homes. Photographs of wounded soldiers, devastated villages, and civilians fleeing conflict zones painted a stark picture of the war's toll. These images, coupled with stories of atrocities, including incidents like the My Lai massacre, fueled outrage and intensified calls for the withdrawal of U.S. forces. The media, public opinion, and political discourse became deeply intertwined, shaping policy and influencing the trajectory of the war. The My Lai massacre, in particular, became emblematic of the moral ambiguities and horrors of the conflict. In 1968, American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, in the village of My Lai. The incident, initially covered up, eventually came to light, causing international condemnation and severely damaging U.S. credibility. It highlighted the extreme pressures and ethical dilemmas faced by soldiers in an unconventional war, as well as the devastating consequences of dehumanization and breakdowns in command and control. For the Vietnamese, My Lai represented one of countless tragedies, emblematic of the human cost borne disproportionately by civilians caught in the crossfire. Throughout this period, North Vietnamese forces continued to demonstrate resilience, adapting to evolving American tactics. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sophisticated network of supply routes traversing the rugged terrain of Laos and Cambodia, facilitated the movement of troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. This logistical feat exemplified the ingenuity and determination of the North, allowing sustained operations despite intense U.S. bombing campaigns aimed at disrupting their capabilities. The trail, often considered a lifeline of the North Vietnamese effort, became both a strategic asset and a symbol of the broader conflict's complexity. Bombing campaigns, such as Operation Rolling Thunder, sought to weaken the North's capacity and will to fight through sustained aerial bombardment. These campaigns involved massive sorties, the deployment of conventional and napalm bombs, and significant loss of life and infrastructure. While they inflicted material damage, the campaigns also hardened resolve, mobilized resistance, and caused immense civilian suffering. International opinion increasingly criticized the use of such tactics, framing the conflict within broader discussions of morality, legality, and the human consequences of warfare. The war, therefore, was not only a military struggle, but a contest of narratives, perception, and global attention. The My Lai situation, in particular, became emblematic of the moral ambiguities and horrors of the conflict. In 1968, American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, in the village of My Lai. The incident, initially covered up, eventually came to light, causing international condemnation and severely damaging U.S. credibility. It highlighted the extreme pressures and ethical dilemmas faced by soldiers in an unconventional war, as well as the devastating consequences of dehumanization and breakdowns in command and control. For the Vietnamese, My Lai represented one of countless tragedies, emblematic of the human cost borne disproportionately by civilians caught in the crossfire. Throughout this period, North Vietnamese forces continued to demonstrate resilience, adapting to evolving American tactics. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sophisticated network of supply routes traversing the rugged terrain of Laos and Cambodia, facilitated the movement of troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. This logistical feat exemplified the ingenuity and determination of the North, allowing sustained operations despite intense U.S. bombing campaigns aimed at disrupting their capabilities. The trail, often considered a lifeline of the North Vietnamese effort, became both a strategic asset and a symbol of the broader conflict's complexity. Bombing campaigns, such as Operation Rolling Thunder, sought to weaken the North's capacity and will to fight through sustained aerial bombardment. These campaigns involved massive sorties, the deployment of conventional and napalm bombs, and significant loss of life and infrastructure. While they inflicted material damage, the campaigns also hardened resolve, mobilized resistance, and caused immense civilian suffering. International opinion increasingly criticized the use of such tactics, framing the conflict within broader discussions of morality, legality, and the human consequences of warfare. The war, therefore, was not only a military struggle, but a contest of narratives, perception, and global attention. Amidst the military strategies and political maneuverings, everyday life for Vietnamese civilians remained precarious. Families faced displacement, destruction of property, and loss of livelihood. Children often grew up amid the constant sounds of artillery and gunfire, their education disrupted and futures uncertain. Women assumed new roles in the resistance, serving as nurses, couriers, and guerrilla fighters, contributing both to the survival of their communities and to the broader military effort. The social fabric of Vietnam was stretched and transformed by the demands of total war, creating a generation marked indelibly by conflict, loss, and resilience. The international dimension of the war further complicated the dynamics. The United States' involvement was justified as a measure to contain communism, while the Soviet Union and China provided support to North Vietnam. Weapons, training, and political backing flowed from these external powers, situating Vietnam as a critical theater in the broader Cold War struggle. Diplomatic negotiations often reflected these global interests, with the balance of power influencing strategies, concessions, and the feasibility of peace agreements. The Vietnam War thus became emblematic of the intersection between local aspirations for national self-determination and the global ideological confrontation of the 20th century. As the U.S. sought to disengage, covert operations and secret campaigns expanded into neighboring countries. Bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos, aimed at disrupting supply lines and sanctuaries for the North Vietnamese, extended the conflict beyond Vietnam's borders. These operations, often clandestine, had profound consequences for local populations, contributing to instability and the rise of new political forces in the region. The long-term repercussions of these actions, including the eventual rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, illustrate the far-reaching consequences of the conflict and the interconnectedness of Southeast Asian politics. Domestic pressure in the United States accelerated the move toward disengagement. The anti-war movement, increasingly influential in shaping public policy, emphasized the human cost, ethical concerns, and geopolitical implications of continued involvement. Protests, demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience became common, highlighting the deep divisions within American society over the war. Veterans returning home often encountered a society grappling with the moral and political ramifications of the conflict, facing both physical and psychological scars, as well as an environment often unprepared to welcome them back. The societal impact of the war, therefore, extended far beyond Vietnam itself, reshaping American culture, politics, and consciousness. Negotiations in Paris, which had begun intermittently in the late 1960s, culminated in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. These agreements called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the release of prisoners of war. Yet, the accords left fundamental issues unresolved, particularly the political future of South Vietnam, the division of the country, the status of the North Vietnamese forces remaining in the South, and the legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government created a fragile and unstable environment. While the U.S. withdrew its forces, the conflict between North and South Vietnamese forces continued, underscoring the limitations of externally imposed peace agreements in the context of deeply entrenched local and national interests. The final phase of the war, culminating in the fall of Saigon in 1975, marked a dramatic and symbolic end. North Vietnamese forces, after a series of coordinated offensives, captured the South Vietnamese capital, leading to the collapse of the government and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. Images of helicopters evacuating desperate civilians from rooftops, the chaos of last-minute departures, and the uncertainty of lives disrupted captured the world's attention. For many, these scenes epitomized the human cost of protracted conflict, the consequences of political decisions, and the unpredictability of war's end. In the aftermath, Vietnam faced enormous challenges. Rebuilding a nation devastated by decades of conflict required extraordinary effort. Infrastructure lay in ruins, agricultural systems were disrupted, and millions of people were displaced or orphaned. The government Even as Vietnam worked to heal from the immediate scars of war, the stories of bravery, suffering, and survival continued to resonate. Former soldiers on both sides grappled with memories that refused to fade. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong veterans carried the pride of victory mixed with the profound weight of loss. Countless comrades never returned, and entire villages were decimated in the struggle for reunification. In the South, former soldiers faced the challenge of reintegration into a society now governed by their former adversaries. Re-education camps, political purges, and social adjustments tested the resilience of those who had once fought for the opposing side, highlighting the deep social and political rifts left by decades of conflict. Meanwhile, American veterans returned home to a country transformed by the war. Many encountered alienation, as the anti-war movement, though successful in shifting policy, often vilified soldiers rather than solely the institutions behind the war. The psychological impact of prolonged combat, post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and moral injury left indelible marks. The war's influence permeated American culture, inspiring literature, cinema, music, and visual arts that attempted to capture, critique, and come to terms with the national experience. Works such as Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Tim O'Brien's literary reflections brought the realities of Vietnam into public consciousness, forcing a society to confront the complex truths of modern warfare and its human costs. At the same time, the Vietnamese people began the arduous task of reconstruction and reconciliation. Cities, towns, and villages had been ravaged by artillery, aerial bombardments, and chemical agents like Agent Orange, which left lingering health and environmental consequences. Agricultural production needed revival. Millions of displaced people required resettlement, while education systems and healthcare infrastructure demanded urgent attention. The government's efforts included land reform, reorganization of industry, and attempts to integrate former combatants into civilian life. These initiatives were complicated by the enormity of destruction, resource scarcity, and the psychological toll on a population that had endured nearly 3 decades of continuous warfare. The war also left an enduring mark on regional politics. Neighboring countries, such as Laos and Cambodia, had experienced their own destabilization due to spillover conflicts. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through these nations, and American covert operations destabilized local governance, contributing to political vacuums that facilitated the rise of insurgent movements. In Cambodia, for example, the destabilization ultimately led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, whose regime would commit atrocities on an unprecedented scale. Vietnam's struggle, therefore, was not contained within its borders. It shaped the trajectory of Southeast Asian geopolitics and influenced global Cold War dynamics. At the same time, economically, Vietnam faced the formidable challenge of transitioning from a war-torn country to a functioning socialist state. Industry, commerce, and agriculture had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Trade, both domestic and international, was limited, and the country experienced shortages in food, fuel, and essential goods. Reconstruction required not only material resources, but human capital. The loss of skilled workers and displacement of populations compounded the difficulty. International sanctions and strained relations with Western nations further limited economic opportunities, pushing Vietnam toward reliance on aid and trade from socialist allies, such as the Soviet Union and China, though political tensions occasionally complicated these relationships. Socially and culturally, the Vietnam War reshaped the fabric of Vietnamese society. Families had endured separation, loss, and trauma. Traditional roles shifted as women assumed new responsibilities both during and after the conflict. Education and literacy campaigns sought to empower citizens and promote socialist values, while attempts to preserve cultural heritage were intertwined with narratives of national pride and revolutionary struggle. The arts became a medium for reflection, commemoration, and the forging of collective identity. Literature, theater, and visual arts documented both the heroism and the tragedy of war, creating a shared memory that would influence generations to come. Internationally, the Vietnam War altered perceptions of military intervention, diplomacy, and global responsibility. For the United States, the conflict became a cautionary tale of the limits of military power, the unpredictability of insurgent warfare, and the complexities of foreign engagement. Strategic lessons were drawn, including the importance of understanding local culture, politics, and terrain, the risks of overestimating technological superiority, and the consequences of disconnecting military objectives from achievable political goals. Similarly, other nations observed the protracted struggle as a testament to the power of asymmetric warfare, the resilience of nationalist movements, and the limits of Cold War geopolitics. Economically, Vietnam faced the formidable challenge of transitioning from a war-torn country to a functioning socialist state. Industry, commerce, and agriculture had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Trade, both domestic and international, was limited, and the country experienced shortages in food, fuel, and essential goods. Reconstruction required not only material resources, but human capital. The loss of skilled workers and the displacement of populations compounded the difficulty. International sanctions and strained relations with Western nations further limited economic opportunities, pushing Vietnam toward reliance on aid and trade from socialist allies, such as the Soviet Union and China, though political tensions occasionally complicated these relationships. Socially and culturally, a Vietnam War reshaped the fabric of Vietnamese society. Families had endured separation, loss, and trauma. Traditional roles shifted as women assumed new responsibilities both during and after the conflict. Education and literacy campaigns sought to empower citizens and promote socialist values, while attempts to preserve cultural heritage were intertwined with narratives of national pride and revolutionary struggle. The arts became a medium for reflection, commemoration, and the forging of collective identity. Literature, theater, and visual arts documented both the heroism and the tragedy of war, creating a shared memory that would influence generations to come. In common life, the Vietnam War shaped the fabric of Vietnamese society. Families had endured separation, loss, and trauma. Traditional roles shifted as women assumed new responsibilities both during and after the conflict. Education and literacy campaigns sought to empower citizens and promote socialist values, while attempts to preserve cultural heritage were intertwined with narratives of national pride and revolutionary struggle. The arts became a medium for reflection, commemoration, and the forging of collective identity. Literature, theater, and visual arts documented both the heroism and the tragedy of war, creating a shared memory that would influence generations to come. Internationally, the Vietnam War altered perceptions of military intervention, diplomacy, and global responsibility. For the United States, the conflict became a cautionary tale of the limits of military power, the unpredictability of insurgent warfare, and the complexities of foreign engagement. Strategic lessons were drawn, including the importance of understanding local culture, politics, and terrain, the risks of overestimating technological superiority, and the consequences of disconnecting military objectives from achievable political goals. Similarly, other nations observed the protracted struggle as a testament to the power of asymmetric warfare, the resilience of nationalist movements, and the limits of Cold War geopolitics. Economically, Vietnam faced the formidable challenge of transitioning from a war-torn country to a functioning socialist state. Industry, commerce, and agriculture had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Trade, both domestic and international, was limited, and the country experienced shortages in food, fuel, and essential goods. Reconstruction required not only material resources but human capital. The loss of skilled workers and the displacement of populations compounded the difficulty. International sanctions and strained relations with Western nations further limited economic opportunities, pushing Vietnam toward reliance on aid and trade from socialist allies, such as the Soviet Union and China, though political tensions occasionally complicated these relationships. Socially and culturally, the Vietnam War reshaped the fabric of Vietnamese society. Families had endured separation, loss, and trauma. Traditional roles shifted as women assumed new responsibilities both during and after the conflict. Education and literacy campaigns sought to empower citizens and promote socialist values, while attempts to preserve cultural heritage were intertwined with narratives of national pride and revolutionary struggle. The arts became a medium for reflection, commemoration, and the forging of collective identity. Literature, theater, and visual arts documented both the heroism and the tragedy of war, creating a shared memory that would influence generations to come. Internationally, the Vietnam War altered perceptions of military intervention, diplomacy, and global responsibility. For the United States, the conflict became a cautionary tale of the limits of military power, the unpredictability of insurgent warfare, and the complexities of foreign engagement. Strategic lessons were drawn, including the importance of understanding local culture, politics, and terrain, the risks of overestimating technological superiority, and the consequences of disconnecting military objectives from achievable political goals. Similarly, other nations observed the protracted struggle as a testament to the power of asymmetric warfare, the resilience of nationalist movements, and the limits of Cold War geopolitics. Economically, Vietnam faced the formidable challenge of transitioning from a war-torn country to a functioning socialist state. Industry, commerce, and agriculture had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Trade, both domestic and international, was limited, and the country experienced shortages in food, fuel, and essential goods. Reconstruction required not only material resources but human capital. The loss of skilled workers and the displacement of populations compounded the difficulty. International sanctions and strained relations with Western nations further. As Vietnam gradually stabilized in the post-war period, the process of reconstruction revealed both the resilience of its people and the enduring scars of conflict. Economic recovery was a monumental task, given the extensive destruction of infrastructure, industry, and agriculture. Roads, bridges, and railways had been heavily damaged, limiting transportation and trade. Factories and workshops lay in ruins, while farmland had been stripped by chemical defoliants and bombings. Yet, through determination, labor, and communal cooperation, Vietnam began rebuilding its cities and revitalizing its economy. Programs focused on rehabilitating agriculture, reconstructing homes, and restoring basic services gradually helped communities regain a sense of normalcy. The human dimension of recovery was equally complex. Millions of refugees displaced during the war sought to return to their homes or find new opportunities. Reuniting families separated by conflict, addressing health crises caused by malnutrition and chemical exposure, and integrating former soldiers and combatants into civilian life were pressing challenges. Social programs aimed at education, vocational training, and public health became vital to rebuilding both individual livelihoods and societal cohesion. These efforts highlighted the essential interplay between infrastructure, governance, and human development in post-conflict societies. Internationally, Vietnam navigated a shifting geopolitical landscape. Initially isolated and reliant on support from socialist allies, the country faced challenges in establishing trade, diplomatic recognition, and economic partnerships. Relations with the United States and Western nations were strained due to unresolved grievances and the legacies of war. Over time, diplomatic engagement, trade agreements, and normalization efforts began to reintegrate Vietnam into the global community, illustrating the pragmatic balance between historical memory and contemporary strategic interests. This gradual opening also facilitated access to technology, investment, and knowledge transfer, further supporting the country's reconstruction and development goals. The Vietnam War's legacy also profoundly influenced military doctrine and strategy worldwide. Nations studied the conflict to understand the limitations of conventional military power when facing guerrilla tactics, insurgency, and asymmetric warfare. The challenges of intelligence, terrain, logistics, and cultural understanding were analyzed extensively by military academies and defense institutions. The war demonstrated that superior technology alone could not guarantee victory when faced with an adaptable and ideologically motivated opponent. Lessons learned from Vietnam informed military planning, counterinsurgency strategies, and diplomatic approaches in subsequent conflicts around the world. Culturally, Vietnam emerged with a renewed emphasis on preserving national identity, history, and traditions. Folk customs, literature, and art forms served as means of processing collective trauma and fostering a sense of continuity. Writers and artists depicted the war not merely as a sequence of military events, but as a human experience encompassing courage, suffering, loss, and resilience. Oral histories, memoirs, and creative works documented personal and communal stories, ensuring that the experiences of ordinary citizens were remembered alongside military and political narratives. This cultural memory played a critical role in healing, education, and nation-building. The educational system also adapted to reflect the nation's recent history. Schools incorporated lessons on the struggle for independence, the war against foreign intervention, and the complexities of the conflict. Curricula aimed to foster a sense of national unity while promoting critical thinking and understanding of historical context. Universities and research institutions contributed to documenting, analyzing, and interpreting the war's events, creating a foundation for scholarly discourse and informed public understanding. These efforts emphasized that education could serve both as a tool for remembrance and as a means of shaping future generations' engagement with history. Healthcare systems faced long-term consequences from the war as well. Exposure to chemical agents, malnutrition, injuries, and psychological trauma created ongoing medical challenges. Programs to treat affected populations, conduct epidemiological research, and provide rehabilitation services became central to national health strategies. International aid, partnerships with medical organizations, and the development of local expertise were critical in addressing these needs. The intersection of public health and post-conflict recovery underscored the broader impact of war on societal well-being, beyond the immediate battlefield. The war also shaped the collective psyche of the Vietnamese population. Memories of loss, displacement, and resilience informed cultural narratives, social interactions, and political attitudes. Generations born during or immediately after the war grew up with stories of survival, heroism, and the importance of communal solidarity. These narratives, passed down through families, schools, and media, contributed to a shared sense of identity and purpose, reinforcing societal cohesion in the aftermath of prolonged adversity. Vietnam's experience demonstrated the interplay between historical memory and contemporary social dynamics, highlighting how nations internalize and interpret their past. At the global level, the Vietnam War influenced international norms, policies, and public opinion regarding intervention, sovereignty, and the human costs of conflict. Media coverage, public protests, and scholarly analysis shaped perceptions of war, ethics, and the responsibilities of nations in international affairs. The lessons of Vietnam resonated in debates over military engagement, humanitarian considerations, and the role of ideology in foreign policy. The war became a reference point for evaluating the effectiveness, morality, and consequences of interventionist strategies in an increasingly interconnected world. The environmental and ecological consequences of the war continued to manifest long after active combat ended. Large areas of forest and farmland had been defoliated, ecosystems disrupted, and biodiversity threatened. Reforestation, soil remediation, and agricultural rehabilitation became critical components of long-term recovery efforts. The ecological damage also provided a stark illustration of how modern warfare extends beyond human casualties, affecting natural resources, habitats, and long-term sustainability. Psychologically, both Vietnamese and American participants faced ongoing struggles. Post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, and the challenges of reintegration into civilian life affected millions. The war's psychological toll spurred advancements in mental health awareness, research, and treatment approaches, highlighting the need for comprehensive support systems for veterans and civilians alike. Societal recognition of these challenges facilitated community-based programs, counseling initiatives, and therapeutic interventions designed to address the long-lasting effects of exposure to prolonged conflict. The war's influence on art, literature, and popular culture cannot be overstated. Filmmakers, writers, musicians, and visual artists interpreted the conflict through multiple lenses, examining ethical dilemmas, human endurance, and the moral complexities of modern warfare. Works from both American and Vietnamese perspectives provided insight into individual and collective experiences, emphasizing the universality of suffering, courage, and resilience in times of crisis. The Vietnam War thus became a cultural touchstone, inspiring reflection and dialogue about the human experience and the responsibilities of societies in times of conflict. Economically, the post-war era demanded innovation and adaptation. Vietnam's integration into the global economy required trade reforms, investment in infrastructure, and development of industrial and agricultural capacity. Strategic planning, coupled with international cooperation, facilitated gradual growth and diversification. The economic recovery illustrated the interdependence of political stability, social cohesion, and material reconstruction, highlighting how nations rebuild after extensive destruction and prolonged conflict. Successes and failures in this process provided valuable lessons for other post-conflict societies navigating similar challenges. Socially, reconciliation and nation-building remained ongoing processes. Communities that had experienced displacement, destruction, and ideological division sought to re-establish cohesion. Programs promoting social welfare, education, and community development facilitated these efforts, while traditional cultural practices helped bridge divides and foster mutual understanding. The legacy of the war informed both policy decisions and interpersonal relationships, shaping the ways in which Vietnamese society navigated trauma, memory, and recovery. As Vietnam continued to heal from the wounds of war, the nation gradually forged a path towards stability and self-determination. The post-war era was marked by both challenges and opportunities, as the government and its people worked tirelessly to rebuild the social, political, and economic fabric of the country. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, and agriculture became central pillars in the nation's recovery, while efforts to address the lingering consequences of chemical defoliants, unexploded ordnance, and wartime destruction demanded sustained attention and international cooperation. Culturally, Vietnam embraced its rich heritage while acknowledging the profound changes wrought by decades of conflict. Literature, music, theater, and visual arts became vehicles for both remembrance and healing, capturing stories of sacrifice, resilience, and hope. Memoirs and oral histories recorded the experiences of soldiers, civilians, and leaders, ensuring that the human dimension of the war would not be lost to time. Schools and universities incorporated the lessons of history into curricula, emphasizing critical thinking and fostering a sense of national identity shaped by both struggle and perseverance. The global perception of Vietnam shifted alongside its internal transformation. Once considered a theater of ideological confrontation, the country began engaging with the international community on new terms. Diplomatic relations were normalized with former adversaries, including the United States, and trade networks expanded beyond traditional socialist allies. This integration into the global economy not only facilitated economic growth, but also fostered cross-cultural understanding and cooperation. Vietnam's journey demonstrated the possibility of reconciliation, strategic adaptation, and progress even in the aftermath of protracted conflict. For those who lived through the war, memory remained a powerful force. Veterans, civilians, and descendants of both sides navigated the complexities of remembrance, identity, and reconciliation. Families who had lost loved ones or endured displacement carried the emotional legacy of conflict, while communities worked to honor the sacrifices of the past while forging new futures. Monuments, museums, and commemorative events provided spaces for reflection, education, and dialogue, bridging generations and promoting collective understanding of both the horrors and heroism associated with the war. The environmental and humanitarian lessons of the Vietnam War have resonated far beyond Southeast Asia. The devastating impact of chemical warfare, extensive bombing, and displacement of populations highlighted the long-term consequences of military strategies that target not only combatants but also the natural environment and civilian communities. Humanitarian organizations, policymakers, and scholars have drawn upon these experiences to inform principles of conflict prevention, post-conflict reconstruction, and international law. The war serves as a case study in understanding the interconnectedness of human, environmental, and geopolitical factors in shaping both the immediate and enduring outcomes of conflict. The psychological toll of the Vietnam War has continued to influence research, policy, and practice in mental health. Studies on post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, and the intergenerational transmission of trauma emerged from observations of veterans and civilians impacted by prolonged conflict. These insights informed approaches to therapy, community support, and reintegration for individuals affected by war, emphasizing the necessity of addressing psychological well-being alongside physical reconstruction. The lessons drawn from Vietnam continue to guide responses to contemporary conflicts and humanitarian crises around the world. Internationally, the Vietnam War redefined concepts of intervention, sovereignty, and ethical responsibility. Governments, scholars, and activists have examined the war to understand the consequences of foreign involvement in internal conflicts, the limitations of military power, and the significance of cultural and political context in shaping outcomes. The conflict highlighted the dangers of ideological rigidity, the unpredictability of insurgent warfare, and the challenges of balancing domestic pressures with international obligations. As such, the Vietnam War remains a vital reference point in global discourse on war, peace, and diplomacy. As decades passed, Vietnam transformed from a nation defined by conflict into a society marked by resilience, adaptation, and aspiration. Cities thrived, industries developed, and education expanded, while the population continued to navigate the complex interplay between tradition and modernity. Veterans shared their experiences with younger generations, fostering understanding, reflection, and dialogue. Communities rebuilt, memorials were erected, and the cultural memory of the war became integrated into national identity, ensuring that the lessons of history would inform future decisions and societal values. The Vietnam War, while a chapter of profound suffering, also illustrated the endurance of the human spirit. It demonstrated the capacity for resistance against overwhelming odds, the importance of community solidarity, and the power of reconciliation in the aftermath of devastation. Individuals and societies learned to navigate loss, rebuild institutions, and reimagine futures, highlighting the intricate relationship between memory, identity, and progress. The narratives emerging from this conflict of courage, resilience, and survival continue to inspire reflection and serve as reminders of both the costs and possibilities in human endeavor. As we reflect on the Vietnam War, it is essential to recognize the multiplicity of experiences, perspectives, and consequences. Soldiers and civilians alike bore witness to tragedy and heroism, shaping a history that is neither monolithic nor simple. The interplay of local agency and global forces, of ideology and human experience, created a conflict whose ramifications extended well beyond the battlefield. In remembrance these stories, we honor the lives affected, the sacrifices made, and the lessons learned, acknowledging that history's complexity demands careful consideration, empathy, and understanding. The enduring relevance of the Vietnam War lies not only in its historical significance, but also in the insights it offers for contemporary societies today. Issues of governance, diplomacy, military strategy, humanitarian response, and societal resilience remain central to global challenges today. By examining the experiences of Vietnam, we gain perspective on the costs of conflict, the importance of cultural and political awareness, and the necessity of fostering mechanisms for peace, reconciliation, and reconstruction. The war's legacy continues to inform policymakers, scholars, and citizens worldwide, underscoring the profound interconnectedness of history and the present. In the end, the story of the Vietnam War is one of both tragedy and triumph. It encompasses the depth of human suffering and the heights of courage and ingenuity. It illustrates the consequences of foreign intervention, ideological confrontation, and protracted warfare, while also highlighting the resilience, creativity, and endurance of those who lived through it. As we examine this history, we are reminded that war leaves indelible marks not only on nations and landscapes, but on the hearts, minds, and memories of people, shaping the course of generations to come. Vietnam today stands as a testament to the capacity for renewal and transformation. From the ruins of conflict arose a society determined to thrive, to educate its citizens, and to engage with the wider world on its own terms. Cultural traditions, artistic expression, and historical memory coexist with modern development, reflecting the interplay of past and present. The narratives of courage, suffering, and survival continue to inform national identity, providing lessons for future generations about resilience, reconciliation, and the pursuit of peace. In remembering the Vietnam War, we honor the complexity of human history, the sacrifices of countless individuals, and the enduring strength of communities in the face of adversity. We recognize that conflict, while destructive, also illustrates the capacities for adaptation, empathy, and moral reflection. By engaging with these stories, we ensure that the experiences of the past continue to inform the decisions, values, and aspirations of the present and future. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.